Imagine walking down a quiet cobblestone street on a warm July morning in 1518. The sun is rising over Strasbourg. Birds are chirping, merchants are setting up their stalls, and life seems blissfully normal. Then suddenly you turn a corner, and what you see will haunt your mind forever. A woman is dancing, but not with joy. She is convulsing, jerking, thrashing wildly in the middle of the street like something has taken over her body. Her shoes are soaked with blood. Her dress clings to her body, drenched in sweat. Her mouth is open, not smiling, but screaming. Her name is Frau Trophäa, and she cannot stop. Her legs move violently against her will, as if invisible hands are puppeteering her limbs. People gather, whispering, crossing themselves, frozen in disbelief. This is not a festival. This is a horror show unfolding in broad daylight. It lasts not minutes, but hours, then days. Her eyes beg for help, but her body refuses. She tries to drink water while dancing, spilling it all down her dress. She pushes away neighbors who try to hold her. She cries out to God, begging to stop. But she can't. And here's the terrifying part: by tomorrow, others will join her. One woman's frantic, unstoppable dance would soon trigger a wave of mass psychogenic illness that would infect hundreds: men, women, even children, all convulsing uncontrollably in the streets. People would die of exhaustion, stroke, and heart failure from dancing. This isn't a horror movie. It's a true story. A mystery so strange, so terrifying, that even modern science still can't fully explain it. What made them dance? Why couldn't they stop? And could it happen again? What you're about to hear is one of the darkest, most disturbing, forgotten plagues in human history. Welcome to the dancing plague of 1518. At first, people whispered that she was cursed. Then they said she was mad. But by the second day, no one was laughing anymore. Frau Trophäa was still dancing. Her limbs moved as if bound by invisible chains, twitching, twisting, beating against the earth with a rhythm no one else could hear. Her eyes were red, not from joy but from weeping. Her body soaked in blood, and sweat looked more like a battlefield than a woman. And then, as if summoned by some invisible plague, it happened again. A man named Klaus, one of her neighbors, began to twitch. At first, it was subtle. A nervous energy in his legs, a restlessness in his spine. But within hours, Klaus was spinning in the street, arms raised like he was dancing with a ghost. His face showed no joy, only terror. He tried to stop. He couldn't. The street had claimed him too. And he was just the beginning. By the third day, 6 more people had joined them. Then dozens. By the end of the first week, over 30 citizens of Strasbourg were dancing themselves to death. Each one moved differently. Some thrashed violently like Frau Trophäa. Others twirled gently, as if possessed by a waltz only they could hear. One man marched like a soldier. Another clapped and stomped as if at a folk festival. It wasn't just their bodies that betrayed them, it was their minds. They knew something was wrong. They were afraid. And they couldn't stop. Here's the terrifying truth: the more people watched, the more the sickness spread. Families who cared for the afflicted found themselves pulled into the dance within days. Spectators simply standing near were suddenly overtaken. It was as if the condition were viral, but not of the body, of the mind. Witnesses said the sickness leapt from eye to limb, from brain to body. One physician at the time called it a plague of the soul. The people of Strasbourg weren't just infected, they were possessed. By the end of July, the city had become a living nightmare, a stage of writhing bodies, echoing screams, and stamping feet. Hundreds were now caught in the frenzy. The cobblestones were slick with blood. The churches were full of prayers that didn't work. And every day more joined. Not by choice, but by something darker. Something that spread not through breath or blood, but through something far more insidious: observation. This is where the plague shattered everything we thought we knew about illness. There were no germs, no poison, no contagion in the traditional sense, and yet it moved faster than wildfire. One glance was enough to trigger it. One moment of empathy, 1 second of fear. It wasn't just dancing. It was psychological collapse on a mass scale. People weren't catching a disease. They were catching an idea. And it raises the most disturbing question of all: if they could lose control so completely in 1518, what about us? Because in the end, this wasn't about music. It wasn't about joy. It wasn't even about madness. It was about human vulnerability, about how fragile our minds become when the world stops making sense. The people of Strasbourg didn't choose to dance. They were pulled in one by something they couldn't name and couldn't fight. Just like Klaus, just like the dozens who followed, just like perhaps us. And it was only getting started. By the second week, Strasbourg was no longer a city. It was a stage, a haunted theater of agony where the audience wasn't watching, they were becoming the cast. As more dancers collapsed and more bystanders began convulsing, panic spread like smoke through the narrow streets. People no longer asked, "What's wrong with them?" They began to whisper, "Am I next?" And with fear came the flood of theories. In a world ruled by God, demons, and superstition, no one looked for microbes. They searched for meaning. The first theory, of course, was the devil. Priests declared that Frau Trophäa and her fellow dancers had been possessed by demons, dark spirits summoned by sin, or perhaps by witches. The way the dancers ignored prayers, flinched from holy water, and twitched in time to invisible rhythms only seemed to confirm it. Exorcists were summoned, holy relics paraded through the streets, but the dancers kept dancing. Then came the witches. Father Heinrich Kramer, the notorious inquisitor and author of the Malleus Maleficarum. The Hammer of Witches personally declared that this was a coordinated spell, a satanic conspiracy meant to destroy Christian civilization through madness. His proposed solution: burn every suspected witch at the stake. Thankfully, even Strasbourg's terrified leaders found that too extreme. But the seeds of paranoia were sown. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Women with red hair or strange herbs were beaten in the streets. The plague had become moral. Meanwhile, doctors had their own explanations, and they weren't much better. The medical consensus: hot blood. Physicians believed the dancers were suffering from overheated humors, an imbalance that could only be sweated out. It sounded logical in theory, but the cure they prescribed would turn a disaster into an apocalypse. There were also whispers of a cursed harvest. Some blamed the rye fields outside the city where a fungus called ergot might have grown during the humid summer. Ergot is known to cause hallucination seizures and even psychosis, similar to LSD. But if that were the case, why was it spreading through the eyes, not the stomach? Why could someone begin twitching just by watching? And then came the most terrifying theory of all. Not from the clergy, not from the doctors, but from the people. They began to wonder, what if it wasn't supernatural? What if it wasn't even physical? What if this was something much worse? A sickness of the mind, a madness that leapt from person to person, not through touch or breath, but through sight, through fear, through empathy. Because the dancers weren't strangers. They were bakers, cobblers, children, mothers. People saw themselves reflected in the twitching eyes and bleeding feet. They didn't just witness the horror. They absorbed it. They became it. Strasbourg's panic wasn't irrational. It was prophetic. The city began to unravel. Markets closed. Festivals were banned. Music was forbidden. Parents covered their children's eyes and locked their doors. But it didn't help. Every new attempt to explain it, every sermon, every diagnosis only deepened the terror. People didn't want answers anymore. They wanted protection. They wanted escape. But from what that was the most paralyzing part. No one knew. The dancers weren't infected in the traditional sense. They weren't coughing blood or covered in boils. They looked normal until they didn't, until they started moving, until their faces turned pale with terror, and their hands began to tremble with that first involuntary twitch. In the chaos, one thing became clear: this wasn't just a disease. It was a mirror. A reflection of how quickly fear can fracture a society. How belief, when mixed with terror, becomes something far more dangerous than ignorance. And as the bodies piled up and the cobblestones ran red with sweat and blood, Strasbourg realized a horrifying truth. Sometimes the mind is the most contagious thing of all. Imagine this: your city is gripped by a terrifying plague, but no one is coughing. No one is breaking out in sores. Instead, they're dancing, not joyfully, but desperately. And your leaders, They look at the chaos, the dead-eyed bodies collapsing in the streets, and say, "You know what we need? More music. That's not a joke. That's history." In one of the most catastrophically misguided public health decisions ever recorded, the City Council of Strasbourg decided that the best way to treat the unstoppable dancing plague was to encourage it. Let's rewind. By the end of the second week, more than 100 citizens were trapped in relentless motion, bleeding through their shoes, gasping for air, unable to sleep or eat, their bodies wearing down like overwound clocks. The city's doctors had no idea what was happening, but based on medieval humoral theory, they concluded the cause was overheated blood. The solution: let the dancers sweat it out. And so, with all the confidence of ignorance, the authorities did what no modern crisis manual would ever advise. They built a stage. Yes, a wooden platform right in the center of the city square. They hired musicians, drummers, fiddlers, pipers. They even brought in professional dancers, convinced that watching trained performers might somehow regulate the chaos. What they created instead was a festival of madness. As the music echoed through the cobbled alleys, the dancers, already moving to rhythms in their heads, began to synchronize with the beat. Their motions became more violent, more frenzied, and tragically, more organized. The very sound meant to soothe became a whip driving their bodies harder. Some musicians who were hired to help became infected themselves, unable to stop playing, their arms aching and blistered. Professional dancers meant to model control were pulled into the same vortex of compulsion. It was as if the stage had become a sacrificial altar, feeding on rhythm and blood. What began as a treatment center turned into a contagion hub. Worse still, the stage wasn't hidden. It was public. It invited audiences. And as it turned out, watching was one of the primary vectors of the plague. Every person who stood in the crowd risked falling under the same spell. Within days, the number of dancers more than tripled. The city square became a grotesque carnival of uncontrolled motion, writhing limbs, screams of exhaustion, music that never stopped, and onlookers silently wondering if they would be next. And still, the officials did not back down. Because to admit failure would mean confronting a truth that terrified them more than the plague itself, that the mind, once broken by fear, was more powerful than their theology, their medicine, or their control. Instead, they doubled down. They ordered more music. They widened the stage. They imported entertainers from other cities. But every addition only widened the cracks in Strasbourg's soul. By the end of July, people weren't just dying from exhaustion, they were dying from management. The city had turned a psychological crisis into a performance, a horror show, a deadly spectacle where civic pride and superstition took precedence over compassion and logic. This wasn't just a failure of policy. It was a failure of imagination, a refusal to believe that human suffering could originate in the mind and still be real. And in that blind refusal, Strasbourg became its own executioner. They didn't stop the plague. They amplified it. They didn't just dance until they dropped. They danced until they died. It started with one collapse, Fra Trofea, the woman who had ignited the fire. After 6 relentless days of movement, her body gave out in the middle of the square. But this wasn't a peaceful faint. Witnesses described it as a slow, agonizing defeat, a body violently resisting death until its final breath. Her legs trembled, her spine arched unnaturally, and her arms jerked like a broken marionette. She collapsed in a heap, gasping for air that her lungs could no longer process. Even after she stopped breathing, her limbs twitched, as if death itself had to wrestle her away from the grip of madness. That was only the beginning. By the second week, dozens more followed her into the grave. Men, women, even children cut down not by sword or plague, but by the sheer biological impossibility of dancing for days without rest. The human body isn't built for that kind of endurance. Muscles tear, joints dislocate, blood thins from dehydration. The heart, strained by constant motion, simply gives up. People collapsed with eyes wide open, drenched in sweat, mouths agape, as if still trying to scream, "Stop," but too weak to make a sound. The deaths came in waves. Some victims died of cardiac arrest. Others from stroke, their brains starved of oxygen as their bodies consumed every ounce of energy just to keep moving. Some choked while trying to eat mid-dance or vomited up what little water they managed to drink. There were even reports of people breaking their own bones from the sheer violence of their thrashing. But perhaps the most chilling were those who died with blank expressions, eyes glassy lips, still whispering the rhythm their minds long gone. These people weren't dancing anymore. They were puppets whose strings had finally snapped. One city physician called it exhaustion of the soul. And the horror didn't end with the dead. The survivors were shells of themselves, physically broken, emotionally destroyed. Many could no longer walk, their joints permanently damaged, feet raw to the bone. One girl's shoes had fused with her skin. Some survivors had to relearn how to stand, how to sleep, how to speak. Their bodies had been so thoroughly hijacked that returning to stillness felt unnatural, even painful. Even worse were the psychological scars. Some dancers never recovered their sense of identity. They described being conscious, fully aware during their ordeal, but unable to control their limbs. Imagine being trapped in your own body, watching helplessly as it destroys itself. And yet the city kept playing the music. By late July, the death toll was impossible to ignore. Some records speak of dozens, others hundreds. But the exact number is less important than the message carved into the memory of Strasbourg. This was not metaphor. People actually danced themselves to death. That phrase, danced to death, sounds almost poetic, even whimsical. But make no mistake, there was nothing beautiful about it. It was grotesque, violent, a carnival of agony performed in slow motion beneath summer sun and torchlight for an audience too scared to look away. This was death not as an event, but as a process, stretched out over hours, days, and every second of it was visible. The real tragedy. No one knew how to stop it, and worse, some didn't want to. Spectacle blurred into sadism. The suffering became normalized. Music played, feet bled, and Strasbourg became a stage where death wore dancing shoes. The music didn't kill them. The silence that never came did. When medicine failed, when prayer failed, when logic collapsed under the weight of mass hysteria, Strasbourg turned to desperation. By August 1518, the city had become a ghost of itself. Streets once bustling with commerce now echoed with the sounds of dragging feet and dislocated joints. The wooden stage was littered with blood sweat and the stench of decay. The musicians had stopped playing, either dead from exhaustion or too terrified to continue. The dance had devoured the dancers, and the city had no answers left. So they turned to a saint, Saint Vitus, the patron of dancers-actors, and ironically those afflicted with uncontrollable movement disorders. In a final, almost surreal move, the Strasbourg authorities ordered a mass pilgrimage to his shrine in the nearby town of Zabern. This wasn't a peaceful spiritual journey. It was a logistical nightmare. Over 400 people, many unable to stand, let alone walk, were strapped to carts, wagons, and stretchers, still twitching, still jerking, still caught in the nightmare. Witnesses describe a procession unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Hundreds of convulsing, half-conscious citizens rolling down country roads, moaning prayers between gasps, surrounded by priests, physicians, and families too afraid to touch them. Some dancers were tied down for their own safety. Others danced alongside the wagons, their feet blistering on the gravel. Villagers along the route watched in stunned silence, clutching rosaries, unsure if they were witnessing divine punishment or hell on earth. And then something changed. At the shrine of St. Vitus, each dancer was brought forward one by one. Priests anointed their foreheads, placed hands on their chests, and whispered blessings into trembling ears. And slowly, miraculously, impossibly, unbelievably, they began to stop. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like a fever breaking. The thrashing slowed, the arms stopped flailing, the eyes refocused. One dancer dropped to their knees and began sobbing uncontrollably. Another reached for the hand of a loved one for the first time in weeks. Dr. Johannes Weyer, a physician who had followed the procession, recorded in his journal, "It was as though the saint himself reached inside their flesh and cut the strings of torment. Whatever dark spirit held them fled." But was it a miracle? Modern minds scoff. Skeptics argue it wasn't faith, but psychological closure. That the act of pilgrimage, the ritual, the expectation of healing the collective experience triggered a break in the mass hysteria. The brain finally offered a way out, took it. The compulsion born of trauma and stress found its antidote in meaning and hope. Maybe it wasn't the shrine that cured them, but the belief that anything could. And yet, for the people of Strasbourg, it was a miracle. After weeks of terror, after bloodied shoes and broken minds, after burying neighbors who died with their feet still moving, the dance had ended. And all it took was surrendering reason to ritual. Faith, where science had failed. In that moment, medieval Europe learned a strange truth sometimes: to cure madness, you have to believe in something more insane. The dancing stopped, but the damage was permanent. The bodies would never fully heal. The minds perhaps even less so. But in the end, when medicine couldn't help, when the church had no answers, when the city was on its knees, a desperate cure was all they had left. And somehow, it worked. The dance was over. But the nightmare had only just begun. When the final dancer collapsed to the ground in August 1518, silence fell over Strasbourg for the first time in over a month. The music had stopped. The stage had been torn down. The blood-stained cobblestones were washed clean. But for the survivors, the rhythm never truly left. It echoed in their bones, haunted their dreams, and trembled in every step they took. The body may heal, but the mind remembers. Many of those who had danced for days, some for weeks, never recovered. Their muscles shredded from non-stop motion, never fully repaired. Some lost the ability to walk. Others limped for the rest of their lives, hunched like marionettes with frayed strings. But the worst scars weren't visible. They were buried in the psyche. Victims described terrifying dreams where they were dancing again against their will, trapped in endless motion as if their bodies had minds of their own. Others developed full-blown phobias of music, of rhythm, even of footsteps echoing in the streets. A former dancer named Greta reportedly locked herself in her home for the remainder of her life, triggered into panic attacks at the sound of drums during religious processions. A boy of just 12 who had joined the dance after seeing his mother afflicted was later found mute, incapable of speech or expression, his eyes wide with terror at the memory of her collapsing mid-twirl. What's more tragic is how the city treated them. Strasbourg, eager to move on, buried the past as quickly as the dead. The event was never commemorated. No plaques, no sermons, no public mourning. Dancers who survived were not honored, they were avoided. Whispers followed them. Employers dismissed them. Some were accused of faking possession, others of harboring demonic influence. Survivors became pariahs, their bodies walking evidence of a horror no one wanted to remember. They didn't just survive the plague, they survived the shame of it. But it wasn't just individuals who suffered. Strasbourg itself was deeply shaken. Nearly 15% of its adult population was either dead, disabled, or had fled. Commerce collapsed. Street performers were banned. Public dancing, once a staple of local festivals, was outlawed. Even wedding celebrations grew quiet. The city square where the stage once stood was ritually consecrated and left empty for years, a silent monument to madness. The church, the doctors, the city council, none had answers. And that helplessness created a kind of civic PTSD. People lived in fear that it would all start again, with a single footstep out of rhythm. Even years later, musicians had to be licensed, and rhythmic drumming was considered dangerous. The trauma had etched itself into policy, into ritual, into daily life. Parents told their children, "Don't stare too long if you see someone dancing," because deep down they feared the truth it might come back. All it needed was a spark, and perhaps the most terrifying part. No one could explain why it ended. No miracle, no medicine, just a shrine, some prayers, and then silence. It left the city and history with a gnawing dread. If it could happen once with no warning and no cause, could it happen again? The trauma of the dancing plague wasn't just physical. It fractured a community's sense of safety, tore apart families, and exposed the terrifying fragility of human control. It proved that a city could lose its mind in broad daylight, and that when the music stops, the silence that follows might be even more unbearable. The dance had ended, but the damage would echo through generations. Everyone had a theory, but no one had the truth. In the aftermath of the 1518 dancing plague, the city of Strasbourg was left not just with broken bodies, but with a question that refused to die. Why did it happen? What could possibly compel hundreds of ordinary people to dance until their feet bled, their hearts burst, and their minds collapsed? The first to answer were the priests. To them it was the devil's work, demonic possession, divine punishment, a curse cast upon a sinful city. The fact that holy relics had no effect on the dancers only confirmed their fears. Some whispered that the afflicted had turned away from God. Others believed a coven of witches had cursed Strasbourg. Father Heinrich Kramer, author of the infamous witch-hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum, personally traveled to investigate. His solution: mass witch trials and executions. Thankfully, the city officials, already shaken by death, refused to unleash even more suffering. Then came the doctors. Rooted in medieval medical theory, they saw the body as governed by four humors. To them, the dancers were overheating with hot blood, and the cure was simple more dancing. Sweat it out. Purge the sickness through motion. It was absurd. It was deadly. But it was the best their science had to offer. Others blamed ergot, poisonous mold that grows on rye. Ergot can cause convulsions and hallucinations. But if it was food poisoning, why did it spread through sight, not bread? Why did people fall ill just by watching? The most desperate theories reached to the sky. 1518 had been a year of strange celestial events. A comet, a solar eclipse. Was it divine wrath raining from the heavens? Was Strasbourg caught in an astrological storm? Astrologers drew charts and consulted stars, claiming cosmic imbalances had infected the souls of the weak. It sounds fantastical, but remember, this was a world where the line between science and magic barely existed, and then the centuries passed. The dancing stopped, but the question lingered. Enter modern science. Today, historians and doctors alike have tried to decode the madness. One leading theory: mass psychogenic illness, better known as mass hysteria. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city on the edge: famine, disease, political unrest. People were starving, grieving, terrified, and under such pressure the mind sometimes breaks. Not alone, but together. When one woman danced, others mirrored her pain. The plague became a collective scream expressed through motion. The theory fits. It explains the patterns, the witnesses, the fear, but it doesn't satisfy the soul, because it still sounds impossible. Other researchers look to neurology, pointing to diseases like encephalitis, lethargica, or movement disorders like Huntington's. Could it have been an undiagnosed virus, a neurological chain reaction, or perhaps a case of conversion disorder where psychological trauma becomes physical symptoms? Modern psychology knows this is real. People can lose their voice, their sight, even control of their limbs without a single physical cause. Was Strasbourg a city convulsing from emotional trauma with no words to describe its pain, but the most haunting theory of all social contagion? The idea that a behavior, an emotion, even a delusion can spread like a virus. You see someone do something, it terrifies you, but part of you mirrors it, and soon you become it. In 1518, that contagion was dancing. In our world, it could be anything: a panic, a conspiracy, a trend, a rage, a fear. Human minds are fragile and frighteningly connected. What started as one woman trembling in the sun became a city spiraling into madness. Not because of demons, not because of mold, but perhaps because of us. Because when fear becomes too much to bear, sometimes the mind escapes in the only way it knows how, and sometimes it takes everyone with it. This wasn't just a medieval nightmare, it's a mirror. The dancing may have stopped in 1518, but the sickness never really left. Because what haunted Strasbourg wasn't just a plague of bodies, it was a plague of minds. And in our modern world, hyper-connected, overstimulated, and starved for meaning, that same invisible contagion is still very much alive. Think about it. In 2016, across towns in America and Europe, people reported sightings of menacing clowns stalking the streets. Panic erupted. Schools locked down. Police departments issued warnings. But when investigators searched for real evidence, there was nothing. Just fear, just stories, just imitation. But the terror was real. People ran. People screamed. Some even attacked strangers in masks. What started as a hoax became a wave of genuine hysteria. It spread not through bites or germs, but through screens and whispers, just like the dancers, or take the TikTok Tourette's epidemic. In 2021, neurologists began noticing an explosion of teenage girls developing sudden severe motor tics. The patterns were eerily similar not to traditional Tourette's, but to influencers who had documented their symptoms online. These girls weren't faking it. Their symptoms were real. Their distress was real. But the cause wasn't neurological, it was psychological. Mass psychogenic illness reborn through digital media, just like the dancing plague but with hashtags. And what about the ice bucket challenge, the Tide Pod challenge, the cinnamon challenge? Seemingly harmless fun until people start getting hurt, until it becomes a compulsion, until it's no longer a choice but a performance. Online validation becomes the rhythm. Likes become the music. The body dances because the world is watching. Sound familiar? Here's the terrifying truth. We are all potential dancers now. Unlike 1518, we no longer gather in public squares, we gather on feeds, on reels, on live streams. We scroll through other people's breakdowns, their fears, their frenzies. We don't just witness, we absorb, we mirror, we participate. Social media has made us more susceptible than ever to emotional contagion. One tweet, one video, one rumor can infect millions within hours. The dancing just looks different. Sometimes it's panic buying toilet paper because someone else did. Sometimes it's storming a government building because others are shouting. Sometimes it's burning out from chasing algorithm gods who feed on your need for approval. But underneath it all, the mechanism is the same. Stress, suggestion, imitation, escalation, collapse. Strasbourg's dancers didn't start a trend. They revealed a truth. That truth is this: human consciousness is not as individual as we like to think. It is porous. It is reactive. It is fragile. Under pressure, the mind finds strange ways to cope. And if enough people are watching, those coping mechanisms can become a movement, a madness, a plague. So the question isn't why they danced. The question is, how close are we to dancing again? Because if a starving, terrified city in 1518 could lose itself to a fever of movement, what happens in a world drowning in anxiety, fear, misinformation, and noise? Look around. Are we dancing already? Perhaps the most unsettling lesson of the dancing plague isn't its mystery, but its familiarity. It reminds us that when the world becomes unbearable, the mind doesn't always break alone. Sometimes, it takes others with it. And that's not just history, that's today. And now we ask the most important question: what does this story mean for us? The dancing plague of 1518 is more than just a historical oddity. It's a mirror reflecting the deepest truths about the human condition. It reminds us that pain doesn't always scream at dances, that trauma doesn't always wound visibly. It moves silently, relentlessly until it consumes. The citizens of Strasbourg weren't weak. They were exhausted, starving, spiritually crushed. Their bodies danced because their minds had nowhere else to go. That's not medieval. That's modern. We see it today in anxiety attacks that feel like heart attacks, in burnout that leaves you unable to get out of bed, in addiction, in social spirals, in the desperate search for control in a chaotic world. What happened in 1518 wasn't about superstition. It was about pressure building in the dark until it exploded through the body. That pressure still exists today, and we still don't fully understand how it shapes us. So here's the deeper message: we are not as rational or as in control as we think, and that's okay. You don't have to be invincible. You don't have to pretend you're fine when you're not. What you do need is awareness, community, honesty. Because the most terrifying thing about the dancing plague wasn't just the movement, it was how long it went unrecognized, how long people suffered because no one truly saw them. That's the lesson. When people are under unbearable stress, they break in strange ways. Not everyone screams for help. Some people laugh too hard, work too much, isolate. Or in Strasbourg's case, they danced. And maybe we've all danced in our own way. Maybe you've pushed through a job that drained you until your body gave out. Maybe you've smiled at dinner while anxiety spun wildly inside you. Maybe you've scrolled through your phone pretending to relax while your mind raced and your soul begged for stillness. That's your version of the plague. That's your involuntary movement. But here's the hope. Once Strasbourg named the plague, once they recognized the pain, only then did the healing begin. They didn't need more dancing. They needed stillness. Stillness brought them back. And maybe that's what we need too. So take this story with you, not as a curiosity from the past, but as a warning from the future. Listen when your mind whispers before it has to scream. Pause when your body twitches before it's forced to collapse. See the people around you, the ones laughing too loud, working too late, or spiraling in silence. They may be dancing and not even know it. This story isn't about the past. It's about what happens when we forget to listen. And more importantly, what might happen if we finally do. If this story moved you even just a little, don't let it end here. Drop a comment below and tell me what part struck you the most. Save this video so you can revisit the lessons when the world feels overwhelming. And if you want more haunting, true stories like this, real history, raw emotion, and powerful meaning, hit that subscribe button. Every click helps this community grow and keeps these forgotten truths alive. Let's uncover the past together, one untold story at a time.